Today we conclude the Aura trio with the mighty Zygarde, the last Pokemon in alphabetical order. Originally revealed in XY as the Z-shaped follow-up to Xerneas and Yveltal, fans eagerly awaited for the seemingly inevitable Pokemon Z version, where Zygarde would surely follow in the footsteps of predecessors Giratina and Kyurem in a brutally powerful new form, or maybe two. Sadly, Zygarde as a box art Pokemon never came to pass, which is a shame because its complete form would have looked absolutely incredible. Just look at the fan art and imagine the wonderful expansion of the Kalos region. The complete and 10% forms were released in the 7th generation, with Zygarde cells being scattered throughout Sun and Moon. Clearly there were plans for Z, but all this was just shoved to the next generation. Ah well, we can still admire Zygarde's inspired designs, generally following its Aura trio's counterpart's origins in Norse mythology, and its complete form even looks like a mecha, or a certain perfect anime villain. Today we'll be examining Zygarde's imperfect, semi-perfect, and perfect forms on the competitive scene. And so, we ask, how good was Zygarde actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. When players first looked at Zygarde, they were impressed by its stats, but they weren't box cover legendary level impressive, nor did it have any particularly shocking abilities or moves that would compensate. Thus, Zygarde didn't follow Xerneas and Yveltal to Ubers. Everyone assumed that, as the third member of the trio, it would get some impressive buffs later in the generation, which we now know didn't happen, of course. So instead, Zygarde was completely passed over in OU, completely outclassed by Garchomp, which was similarly bulky, much faster, much stronger, and boasted Swords Dance and Stealth Rock, as well as an actually valuable ability in Rough Skin. What could Zygarde do in OU? Some players would experiment at points with unique options like Glare, Dragon Dance, Coil, but these were unreliable gimmicks, not threatening much at all. Zygarde was just too weak and lacked the coverage to be effective. Instead, Zygarde fell to UU, where it was much more successful. Its stat spread dwarfed its new colleagues, with its bulk letting it set up multiple Dragon Dances or Coils, even in the presence of super effective attacks, and overwhelming nearly all in its path. Just because you had, say, Florges didn't mean you were safe. If anything, you were probably lulled into a false sense of security, only to get blasted apart once your team had taken the slightest bit of chip damage, an issue exacerbated by how difficult it was to meaningfully scratch Zygarde's huge bulk. It was especially adept at devouring physical moves. Thus, it was no surprise when Zygarde was banned from UU quite early on, alongside Tornadus Therian. Though at the end of XY, Zygarde made its return to the tier. The player base ultimately decided its influence on the tier, which was water types needing to run Ice Beam, Toxic Spikes being more popular, was not an unreasonable or negative one. Then Oraz came around and players realized just how much potential Zygarde had to absolutely run away with games when invested in its bulk and adapting its moveset. It was very little effort and opportunity cost for enormous gain. Even the metagame shifting to have ice coverage everywhere possible, like Hippowdon and Mega Aerodactyl, couldn't stop it. Its bulk boosting and brute force would always manage to get the edge. Suddenly, the metagame was all about Zygarde, using it, defending against it, and the quest for optimization on both ends. Zygarde was so good, it overwhelmed most of the tier's nuance and steamrolled over everything. Finally, this new Z-shaped tier reached its logical conclusion. Battles became decided by whoever managed to set their Zygarde up first. There was no other way around it to stop it. It simply beat too many Pokemon, used them for setup fodder, and that would be that. As a result, Zygarde was once again banned to BL, and this time it wouldn't return. So all in all, quite a solid debut generation. Hey, remember those promised buffs? They're here now. Gen 7 arrived, and so too did several brand new Zygardes. We're not just talking the two forms it received. Even base Zygarde was effectively a completely different Pokemon on account of its brand new signature move, Thousand Arrows, a ground type move that bypassed ground immunities. Yeah, forget those flying types. They're only the most common way of answering ground moves since they and Earthquake debuted side by side back in the mid-90s. Forget those levitate Pokemon too. The supposed saving grace was that Thousand Arrows packed quote-unquote only 90 base power, but when you have such a ridiculously spammable move, it makes up for the low initial strength, kind of like another famous example in Aegislash's Shadow Ball. Of course, Zygarde's attack stat was nowhere as impressive, but when boosted by Choice Band or potentially boosted even further by Dragon Dance or Coil, it became one of the scariest attacks in the tier. But wait, before Zygarde itself was OU, one of the new Zygarde forms was. Gen 7 gave it the Power Construct ability, which allowed it to transform into Zygarde complete once it hit 50% health. What was the difference about Zygarde C? Well, its special attack was boosted, yeah, nobody cares. And its speed was lowered, okay, that's annoying, but it wasn't anything drastic or unimaginable. Those weren't too noticeable though. What was noticeable was that Zygarde's base HP jumped from an already massive base 108 to an incomprehensibly colossal base 216. This was the 4th highest in the game, only behind Guzzlord, Chansey, and Blissey. Zygarde was already incredibly bulky, but in its complete form, it was just absurd. For just one quick go-to example, it could effortlessly survive various Draco Meteors from Latios. Zygarde C devoured absolutely every attack in OU to hilarious effect and used this to become the scariest boosting sweeper around. The player base had barely registered its existence, let alone the full extent of its hit-taking abilities when it received the Banhammer. And when it received the Banhammer, it was incredibly quick, lasting about 3 days in OU. Zygarde complete's hit-taking abilities extended to the Uber tier, and it excelled in both offensive and defensive roles, depending on what type of team it was used on, and it fit on just about every type of team. Big Boss, as it was called, was the offensive Dragon Dancer. Any Zygarde form would have honestly been good even with just DD and 1000 arrows. That's how good a stab move it was. But Big Boss bolstered itself further with Substitute, the toxic blocker, which also helped activate Power Construct, and in the last slot it could mess with opponents further via Dragon Tail, letting it beat Lugia and Skarmory to the phase. Glare to spread the ever useful paralysis for the benefit of both itself and its teammates, or Protect to regain crucial leftovers. Its item was malleable too. Leftovers were the go-to, but it could also overcome its low attack stat with a Z Crystal, usually Groundium Z, with a boosted Tectonic Rage particularly useful for ripping through Xerneas, but with Dragonium Z viable as well for the likes of Mega Salamence and Giratina Origin. Alternatively, defensive Zygarde was an incredible Pokemon, with physical hit-taking capability that simply boggled the mind. Without resisting it, it took absolute pittance from Mega Lucario's adaptability boosted close combat, for example, to say nothing of how the likes of Primal Groudon's Precipice Blades bounced off. It could use this capability for a slow setup sweep using Coil, or it could go all in on support with Sleep Talk, ensuring it was still active after resting. Either way, Zygarde was a fixture on stall, and no matter where it wound up, it was one of the best Pokemon in the tier, one of the most defining forces in Gen 7 Ubers. So back to base Zygarde, which took up the 1000 arrow spamming mantle in OU as soon as its complete form departed, and it was excellent. Its choice band set was superb with such immediately spammable power. Forget using Landorus Therian to stop this ground move unless your goal was to eventually be overwhelmed. Zygarde got plenty of opportunity to spam the move as it ripped through Staples, Heatran, Toxapex, and Magearna with ease, and it also had absolutely fantastic revenge killing in the strong priority of extreme speed, particularly valuable in a volatile metagame like early Sun and Moon. It could also go for the sweep with Dragon Dance, being a particularly fierce Z-move user, whether it was powering up arrows or outrage. Wait, what about the incredibly bulky Tapu Bulu, who resisted 1000 arrows and was immune to outrage? Oh, never mind, it got Iron-tailed into dust. Stopping Zygarde was incredibly difficult, and it became an OU staple. Things started to get out of hand in Ultra Sun and Moon, as the player base noticed just how flexible Zygarde's moveset could be, and they began to experiment more and more with Glare, appreciating the sheer game-breaking power of an opponent fully paralyzing in the face of something already so dangerous. Suddenly, choice band sets realized they didn't need outrage, and were now running Glare, yes, a choice bander spreading paralysis, for itself. That's how many opportunities to switch in Zygarde got, and the setup sets using Glare, now those were the stuff of nightmares. Coil made Zygarde utterly unbreakable on the physical side, and most special attackers didn't want to actually deal with it, and if they did switch into it, it paralyzed them from behind its substitute, ruining them and making them just another victim on its relentless path to sweeping. Even Zygarde's actual checks would be overwhelmed just by full paralysis and boosting. Tapu Bulu, yeah, enjoy having Zygarde set up in your face. Eventually, players realized Zygarde was so bulky that it didn't even need the protection of substitute. It could just rest instead, making it much more comfortable at actually switching into attacks without needing the perfect turn to set up from full, while also avoiding status. Being so bulky that you could afford the free turns of rest in a meta as strong as Gen 7 OU was really something, and it was particularly apt in utterly ruining the fast toxic Gliscor sets that had popped up as one of the few truly safe answers to the sub variant. Oh, while this was going on, Zygarde was also running Rest and Sleep Talk on its choice band set, utterly unheard of, and yet Zygarde pulled it off perfectly. Oh, you stopped the banded Zygarde with status? Oh, never mind, you didn't. And on top of all this, Zygarde could mix and match movesets to its heart's desire to become even more ruinous. So it wasn't bad enough that it was going to brute force its way through you. It was unpredictable as well. Weakness policy Dragon Dance, dare to hit it with a super effective attack and watch your entire team crumple. Sub Toxic Protect with 1,000 arrows as the stab. It was the perfect user of the strategy. Don't forget the classic Z move variants. The variations in moves and EVs and natures and items went utterly ballistic, and eventually the player base was screaming for a Zygarde suspect. After some time, they received it, and Zygarde was hit with the Banhammer, much to the relief of the OU metagame, which cracked jokes about how they could actually use flying types to eat ground moves now. Celesteela and Rotom were particularly pleased. Zygarde also had another form given to it in Gen 7, the 10% form, which saw it lose all the bulk of the other two, but in exchange it became much faster, jumping up to a stunning base 115. Despite some niche attempts, it wasn't going to be much for OU. It was quite decent in Sun and Moon UU, though its frailty held it back, especially because it wasn't quite as powerful as it'd like. It really made its home in RU though, where its talents were on full display, en route to becoming one of the best Pokemon in the tier. It was pretty much the same old Zygarde, whether Dragon Dancing or Choice Banding, just much faster. It outsped and hit a huge portion of the best Pokemon in the tier for huge damage, such as Metagross, Virizion, Registeel, Roserade, and Ninetales. Sure, Zygarde's 10% 1,000 arrows wasn't shattering everything in sight immediately, but its spam ability meant that the opponent wouldn't be able to withstand it forever when coming off of a choice band, especially with support from Spikes and Switch Move, using teammates like Scarf Passimian, helping it hit the field to compensate for its frailty. Alternatively, Zygarde could hang back until the end of a game, where the opponent would be weakened, and finish them off with ruthless efficiency with his Dragon Dance set. It was so fast that beating it with any Scarfer, save for the occasional Noivern or Salazzle, was out of the question, even with an adamant nature that Zygarde occasionally liked to ensure it grabbed its KOs. Plus, the Stealth Rock weak Noivern and Salazzle were vulnerable to Zygarde's boosted extreme speed. The ability to attack the opponent with both moves and switch between them was efficient as well. Wait, didn't Outrage lock it in? But that's where Dragonium Z came in. A boosted, devastating Drake ripped through even bulky checks like Donphan, Milotic, and Umbreon, and generally caused havoc without forcing Zygarde to go for the Outrage, meaning the opponent would still have to dance around it after, if the game wasn't already done by that point. Switching around these fast, boosted attacks wasn't exactly something teams could do without sustaining immense damage. Regardless of whether it went with Dragon Dance or Choice Band, Zygarde 10% was a top-tier fixture of the RU metagame, capping off an absolutely insane 7th generation for Zygarde as a whole. Zygarde's 1,000 arrows seemed primed for VGC success, as it not only hit flyers and levitators, but was a spread move on top of that. The problem? 1,000 arrows wasn't a huge base power move, and Zygarde didn't have huge base attack, and it was a restricted Pokemon, meaning it had serious competition for its team slot, and the Pokemon it was competing with blew it out of the water power-wise, while also providing the type of huge bulk and support Zygarde offered. It wasn't that Zygarde was bad, no, not by a long shot. If it weren't a restricted Pokemon, it'd surely be incredibly popular, as its bulk was utterly superb even for a restricted Pokemon. It could use this to boost with Coil, making itself even more impenetrable on the physical side, while strengthening its 1,000 arrows and great priority in extreme speed as well. While on the special side, it boosts its bulk with Misty Seed alongside Tapu Fini. However, when you're fighting the likes of Xerneas, Primo Groudon, and Mega Rayquaza for slots, even great Pokemon are usually not going to cut it. Zygarde was also hurt by Xerneas' insane popularity and dominance. Running a restricted Pokemon so hapless against it was generally not a great strategy, since even if Zygarde could take a hit, it wasn't doing much back. Thus, Zygarde's usage was limited, though it did collect a decent number of very respectable placements. These players on screen did very well with Zygarde at their respective regional. Overall, Zygarde was one of the tougher restricted Pokemon to work with, but it had its small niche in the 2019 VGC metagame. Upon returning to Generation 8 in Crown Tundra, Zygarde was briefly allowed in OU once again, though not in its complete form, of course. That would be absurd. Allowing base Zygarde though, nothing crazy about that at all. Surely it wouldn't proceed to do exactly what it had done before, and it got banned. Turns out it did exactly the same things it had done before, minus Z moves, but Zygarde didn't need those anyway. Once again, it choice banded and dragon danced and glared and coiled its way to victory with absurd ease. 1,000 arrows lending it all the flexibility in the world to take advantage of its great stats and move pool. Its enormous bulk giving it the leverage needed to cleave through everything, whether with immediacy or prolonged setup. Its ban came as a surprise to no one. Zygarde Complete returned to Ubers, once again oscillating between physically defensive coil rest sets on bulkier teams, providing an incredible check to physical attackers like Ho-Oh and Necrozma Duskmane, as well as a boosting win condition in the long term, and more offensively invested sub-DD variants for faster play on more aggressive teams, though even these sets enjoyed an impish nature and defensive investment, as it allowed Zygarde C to set up more easily. It did incredible things like have its substitute survive Brave Birds and Sunsteel strikes from defensive variants of Ho-Oh and Duskmane respectively. Zygarde C was already a staple with these sets, its massive bulk letting it blanket check everything from Mars Shadow to Calyrex Shadow, a great help in finding balance for his team against the oft-volatile nature of the hard-hitting Ubers metagame. But it also had another set which was potentially so terrifying, it received its own name, Demon Zygarde. Instead of 1,000 arrows, this set used its other signature move, 1,000 waves, which would trap the opponent it hit, except unlike, say, Magma Storm, which trapped the opponent for a few turns while doing damage, this was more akin to Block, which would trap the opponent permanently or until the user of the move switched out. Then when the likes of Ferrothorn or Tangrowth switched into Zygarde, it wouldn't just coil 6 times, it would also scale shot, boosting its speed as well. Yeah, forget chasing out this Zygarde with your Scarf Kyogre, you'd get dropped by a plus 6,000 waves instead, and that meant pretty much nothing else was going to take it on either. Demon Zygarde was a game ender. There was little more heart-shattering than having it 1,000 waves you on the switch and realize what was about to happen, and that you were completely helpless to stop it from boosting up and winning the game. You're better off just forfeiting and saving yourself the excruciating, drawn-out loss inevitably headed your way. This wasn't a Zygarde to be slapped on just any team, but well, to have a moveset with Demon in the name in a tier as stacked as Ubers was no mean feat. Overall, Zygarde Complete was the complete package in Ubers once again. Since base Zygarde was being used in OU at the time of the Crown Tundra, there was absolutely no use for Zygarde 10%, which had started in OU like all other fully evolved Pokemon. However, since its usage was basically nil, it dropped not to UU, but all the way down to PU, where it predictably shredded the tier into a mess of mangled ribbons, outspeeding and crushing all in sight effortlessly and hilariously with its classic choice band set, 1,000 arrowings everything into oblivion. Actually, didn't PU have Tangela? Wasn't that a counter? Yeah, it had one counter, and the entire rest of the tier got destroyed by it. Really healthy dynamic. Zygarde 10% rose to its old home of RU, where it was excellent once again. Sure, it missed Z moves, so it wasn't as scary a Dragon Dancer, but all it really needed was its choice band variant, the easiest Pokemon to use ever. Just click 1,000 arrows every time. It actually was so good at this, nobody even thought about Dragon Dance. They were too busy being so overwhelmed by band sets that Zygarde was put up for a suspect test. The tier was simply not equipped to handle it. Its general go-to answers were bulky Pokemon like Necrozma, Suicune, and Milotic, and those got overwhelmed over time, especially with hazard support. The only way to really switch into 1,000 arrows was with Zarude, which got slammed by Skitter Smack or Superpower. Dealing with Zygarde 10% was so oppressive that the player base resoundingly campaigned for its ban, and away it went with an enormous majority vote of 90%. Zygarde 10% didn't stop there, no. Moving up to UU and proceeding to 1,000 arrows the daylights out of the metagame as well. When you've got top tier Pokemon such as Nihil-Eagle, Cobalion, and Excadrill, you're going to be prone to arrow spam, especially when even the frail Zygarde 10% was actually quite a decent Nihil-Eagle switch. The list of totally safe switch-ins to 1,000 arrows was Tangrowth. Great Pokemon, great answer, no doubt about it, but if that's really the only safe one, then Zygarde 10% will slot Toxic into its moveset and have fun dealing with that when literally everything else gets blasted by arrows. Getting overwhelmed in the long term with continuous spam, or in some cases, Zygarde 10%'s other moves. Salamance's Intimidate wouldn't stop it from getting decked by Outrage, and Chansey got hit hard by Superpower. Meanwhile, Arrow's vulnerable bulky Pokemon like Togekiss, Slowking, and Amoonguss were always just a chip away from succumbing. Zygarde 10% speed tier was on full display in its quest to 1,000 arrows anything and everything in sight, getting the jump on the plethora of Pokemon in the wide, important base speed range of 85 to 110. In addition to the aforementioned, there was also Hydreigon, Thundurus Therian, Keldeo, and Lycanroc Dusk, among many others, and the few faster Pokemon were, of course, vulnerable to its strong extreme speed. Zygarde 10% wasn't just great in a vacuum either. It was great at enabling teammates like Primarina and Keldeo, who became much scarier when Zygarde was messing with the grass types that were used to answer them. All in all, Zygarde 10% was an excellent force in UU and one of the easiest Pokemon to use to boot. This capped off another massively successful generation. Zygarde was similarly specific as a restricted Pokemon in Gen 8 VGC, though it did have its interests. Some players attempted to make it work with more fast-paced Lumberry Dragon Dance variants. Still, Zygarde once again had the issue of not only competing with, but matching up badly against a Fairy-type restricted Pokemon that completely ruled the roost. This time, it was Zacian Crown, though at least Zygarde could hit that super effectively with 1,000 arrows. Not nearly enough to threaten it to the same degree that it was threatened first though. The popularity of Kyogre didn't do Zygarde any favors either. Still, Zygarde had its place and had some solid finishes, with these players on screen doing particularly well at their respective tournaments. Overall, as far as restricted Pokemon go, Zygarde wasn't one of the better ones, but it was alright. And that's it. So how good was Zygarde actually? Well, its debut generation wasn't a bad one, as it found itself dominating UU and being banned from the tier, then being unbanned and proceeding to punish the player base severely for doubting its power, as it completely warped the metagame in its image. First Zygarde to set up wins. It was in Gen 7 that Zygarde really came into its own though. Its complete form was instantly banned from OU and proceeded to dominate Ubers. Its base form was a dominant fixture in OU well into Ultra Sun and Moon, until its incredible set variety and general effectiveness proved to be too much for the tier as well. And even its 10% set was an elite force in RU. Phew. And then in Gen 8, it was more of the same, except this time the complete form didn't even touch OU, just instantly settling into Uber's excellence again, while the base form was the one barely lasting any time in OU before being ousted. Meanwhile, the 10% form spammed 1,000 arrows throughout the lower tiers to immense success, getting banned from its old home of RU and excelling in UU. Zygarde hasn't been much of a VGC Pokemon, but that's mostly because of incredible competition for a restricted team slot. If it weren't a restricted Pokemon, it'd be used a lot more, and it still managed some decent success despite its limitations. So overall, Zygarde may have been deprived of its own Pokemon game, but at least it's been incredibly successful in the competitive scene. Thanks for watching, everyone. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Zygarde? Do you want to see it return to Gen 9? Whatever it is, let us know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos. And thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.